Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for virtually joining us today. We would like to welcome you to the UCF College of Sciences COSTalks, a distinguished speaker series. I'm Tasha Dupre, Interim Dean of the UCF College of Sciences. This distinguished speaker series celebrates the diversity of contributors to outstanding scholarship in the natural and social sciences. The intention of the series is to promote diversity and inclusion among our faculty and students by bringing highly successful academics from historically underrepresented backgrounds to UCF. Additional important goals of the series are to encourage our UCF undergraduates from historically underrepresented backgrounds to continue their pursuits in the natural and social sciences, and also to enrich graduate student professional development by providing opportunities to interact with diverse faculty. Thank you all once again for attending our talk this afternoon. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Schultz, Professor and Chair of the Department of Anthropology, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. Schultz.
Thank you, Dr. Dupre. Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Robin Nelson as the Department of Anthropology's COSTalks Distinguished Speaker. Dr. Nelson is an Associate Professor in Anthropology at the Department of Santa Clara University in California. She previously held faculty positions in anthropology at Skidmore College in New York and the University of California, Riverside. Dr. Nelson also was a postdoctoral fellow in the Laboratory of Human Biology Research at Northwestern University. Further, her PhD and MA degrees are in biological anthropology from the University of Michigan, and her BA degree is in anthropology from Brown University. Dr. Nelson's research applies the evolutionary theories of kin and parental investment to studies of sociality and health in contemporary Caribbean populations. Her recent work focuses on caretaking strategies, residential context, and how child health outcomes contribute to a broad focus on the influence of social experiences on health outcomes over the lifespan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelson, whose presentation is entitled Bridging Theory and Building Kin, Research and the Intersection of Race, Ism, Family, and Health.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here and to be included as part of the conversation at UCF. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my thinking around the intersections of the studies of race, family, and health. So interestingly, we're going to start with Da Vinci in 1512. So John is part of a collection of anatomical illustrations completed around 1512. Da Vinci gives us one of the earliest illustrations of the proper positioning of the fetus within the womb. And he understood the umbilical cord to be a vessel that translated materials between the mother and fetus. And according to Christine Constrata at Stony Brook University, Da Vinci was focused on the mechanical functionality of the human body. Form following function is a central theorem used in evolutionary studies. And while we most frequently apply this maxim to studies of morphology, it resonates in studies of familial dynamics, child thriving, and the way that humans make meaning via our relationships and the ways that that meaning is encoded in our bodies. What Da Vinci is getting at in part with this illustration is a bigger question in anthropology more broadly, but specifically biological anthropology. And that is, what does it mean to actually be human? What are we looking at? What are the actual features of our species that are specific and unique? And so to that end, we often ask this question in a lot of our introduction to anthropology classes. What does it mean to be human? Do we mean language? Do we mean symbolic representation? Or is there something happening with our anatomy that makes us a specifically human species? Much of what has defined biologically, or what was once mostly known as physical anthropology, has been a focus on a kind of methods, and specifically quantitative methods, along with a natural history recording. Research questions and theory certainly have defined our methods, but it makes it, what we do in terms of our quantitative methods are a bit different than other subdisciplines within anthropology. As integral as ethnography has been to cultural anthropology, various but almost always quantifiable methods have been central to physical and what is now biological anthropology. Early anthropometry, craniometry, as you can see in this illustration, was the kind of backbone of physical anthropology. It was this assessment of the human form. And this conversation about what makes us human has hinged on the juxtaposition of humans as compared to our closest living relatives, non-human primates, and what made human populations different from one another. And so Boas says in 1904, the subject matter of anthropology is partly that of biology and partly that of the mental sciences. Very early on, this idea of assessing what it means to be human was engaged very deeply in figuring out how to explain, or rather justify, the differences and inequities that were being enacted upon people of different backgrounds. And so on the natural varieties of mankind, Blumenbach systematized the study of race. And part of what it means to be a biological anthropologist is diving a bit deep into our history as a subdiscipline and understanding the role that we have played in creating the race construct. And so this begins not with Blumenbach, but Blumenbach is one of the kind of early founders of the race concept. And using skull shapes and other physical characteristics, he categorizes humans into 5 categories: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay. And we consider him to be a founder of German anthropology. What we see in Crania Americana from Morton in 1839 are kind of the supposed differences between skulls of different races. And Morton, along with many other early biological anthropologists, identified people of African descent as being closer to non-human primates in this kind of linear scaling towards a kind of more human existence, with people of European ancestry being the most human. So why does this matter now? Why do we think about this now? The ways that we have kind of included humans within a larger conversation of the natural sciences has implications today. So even Linnaeus, very early on, was thinking about race and categorizing humans into different races. And of course, in part, committing a naturalistic fallacy and talking about and biological deterministic ideas, and talking about personalities as being or behavioral traits as being grouped onto race and associated with different races. And so you have European people here identified as white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, governed by laws. If you are of African descent, you are Black, choleric, obstinate, contented, and regulated by customs. So we see this kind of throughout very early anthropology. We know of Boas's early work with immigrants and his study out of 1912, where he's looking at skull shape, size, and how it changes over time, and kind of trying to problematize this idea that race is biological, but it never really goes anywhere. And this kind of thread of quantifiable science and skull measurements and anthropometry as rigor stays within biological anthropology and broader anthropology, frankly, and spreads itself throughout other social sciences through, until the current day, I would say, but it starts to be challenged quite a bit around the turn of the century or mid-century. And so what you start to see in different aspects of anthropology and the theory that anthropology is pulling from, we start to see this kind of call to curb the rise of scientism. That we can't just lean into science as being an explanatory mechanism for all kinds of differences. That we need to question the conclusions that we are coming to by leaning into these kinds of data. And so we start to see, in cultural anthropology, theorists kind of pulling from Derrida and Foucault. In biological anthropology, you see a parallel stream where we see Sherwood Washburn talking a bit about the new physical anthropology in 1951. Now, of course, there were actually Black scholars who had been calling for a quote unquote new physical anthropology far before Sherwood Washburn in 1951, but we do see this kind of come to prominence and become a little bit sticky in the discipline where folks start to pay attention to it upon Washburn's publication. We also see this kind of new biocultural synthesis comes out by Goodman and Leatherman, where we start to see folks saying, what else do we need to know about the human condition besides these kinds of early race studies and this quantification of human difference? And maybe this focus on biological race, which we know is not an entirely valid construct, needs to be further questioned, and we need to push it to the periphery. And so how do we think about ways of knowing and defining relationships? So we can think a bit about, ethnography, oral traditions in communities, social and community knowledge. And so in the Northern Kentucky Photographic Archives, you can see stories of families. These are recordings of Black families and what Black families were doing, 50, 60 years ago. So we have storytelling, we have food preparation and food sharing, and you see this thread emerge before this time, but you see it really kind of emerge in the 1970s, lots of discussions of the way that food creates kinship between people. And we need to kind of move away from thinking about kinship as this purely genetic thing that is also tied to race, but we also need to think about practice. And then we also see kind of kinship and family being created via communal care. So what are ways of knowing beyond quantifiable science? Well, maybe we need to think about people's behavior. Maybe we need to think about what they're doing and how they're creating relationships, rather than thinking that we can quantify these things in this kind of push towards scientism, which was happening a little bit earlier. However, while there is this thread of kind of conversation going on in the social sciences, where we are really interested in behavior and kind of created relationships and the performance of relationships, there is still this emphasis in kind of the application of social science, where we see that ideas about familial forms and types and certain practices being, I wouldn't say more human anymore, but certainly more healthy, more normal, that thread stays present. And so what we see is that in a lot of research on Black families specifically, when we move away from kind of just looking at Blackness as race, and we start thinking about Blackness as behavior, and we can problematize that as well, we start to see a discussion of matrifocality. And what does it mean to have women being a center point in many families? Well, this is labeled as pathological, right? So we move away from pathology from skull shape to pathology as being enacted via behavior. There's a whole question about matrifocality, once we kind of have this matrifocality in Black and brown communities being highlighted, we start to ask questions. And by we, I mean social scientists and the policymakers who are using social science research. So think Moynihan report. We start to see this kind of matrifocality as being maybe a problem for children. Can we think about this problem? And you can see this in this table of illegitimacy. And we see this in Black American, studies of Black American families, but also studies of Caribbean families. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is my work on the Caribbean. But this thread is not, this thread of kind of Blackness, matrifocality, and race as pathological, Black race, Black behavior as pathological, is not just specific to the Americas. It's also happening in lots of places where Black people live and thrive. And so in 1966, Lewis starts writing on the culture of poverty, and this all gets tied in together. So Blackness as pathological, matrifocality as pathological, and a kind of social, what I would call a social scientism, where we're trying to understand how families behave without quantifying everything, but we're still labeling some people as more human and other people as less human. And so in this work, in this 1966 work, it says the family and the culture of poverty, which in his case happens to be families in Puerto Rico, does not cherish childhood as a especially prolonged and protected stage in the life cycle. And so we see this shift in the literature, and particularly in social science literature, away from thinking of race as biological, but race as kind of reflected in behavior, and those behaviors that are associated with Black and brown families as being pathological. And so in the anthropological sciences, which is where my research is located, you can see these kinds of two threads of investigations. We're thinking about cultural practices, which are community and family norms, quote unquote traditions, invented or otherwise, and the fluidity and pressures that people face when they're living in their cultural spaces, along with biological processes. So as biological anthropologists in the anthropological sciences, we're often interested in physiological settings and set points in the body, hormonal regulation, and energetic access and energetic changes over time in the body. And so the central challenge and promise, I think, of completing research with contemporary human populations is the ability to potentially identify the biocultural and behavioral features that define us as a species, while making sense of the broad diversity in the performance of these features and managing the inherent noise in these data. And so today I'm going to talk to you a bit about my research on familial networks, the material and labor of care work and child thriving in Jamaica. And I discuss the gap between individual desire and ideologies regarding parenting, ideas about progress and the family, either coming from individuals or coming from kind of the broader community, and the actual practices of child rearing and the policies that constrain the ability of parents to make different kinds of parenting choices. And I framed the discussion, these discussions of the everyday lives of Black families in Jamaica in light of the evolutionary mandates of child survival. And so when I think through questions of racism, family, and health, some of the questions that arise, and racism is not always at the forefront, but it comes back, and you'll see this kind of as we go through the talk. It's kind of who is doing care work? So who is actually doing the labor of caregiving in these communities? What care counts? Not all care is kind of equally meaningful or impactful for the lives of the recipients of this care. How are these experiences embodied by young children? That's interesting to me as a biological anthropologist. And what data are needed to understand this process? And so with the question of what data are needed to understand this process, I think we have to think kind of at different levels. And so we have kind of data that we can collect from individuals every single day in our research sites, but I'm also thinking about kind of the data of understanding policy, understanding broader socio-political movements, labor pressures, and how all of these things are tied up in kind of notions of race and racism. And finally, one of my motivating questions in my broader research is the ability, how well can we discern the difference between thriving and surviving? From an evolutionary standpoint, we focus quite a bit on survival. As a biocultural anthropologist, I'm also quite interested in thriving. And so what does an everyday life look like? And how do we move beyond just thinking about who lives and who dies? So to that end, I'm collecting data to answer a few questions. What are the embodied markers of life's experiences? What is the cost of survival for parents and their children? And how do Caribbean families at home and abroad construe care work? I've been working on these kinds of questions for some time. I started with the Jamaican Sociality and Health Project, and now I've moved on to thinking about a bit of the non-kin care and child thriving project, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So the Caribbean in the anthropological imagination is kind of a fascinating thing to think about. So in the early studies, and this is where these questions of race, racism, family, and health all begin to intersect, we see this tradition of Herskovits and E. Franklin Frazier. And the focus, as it was in much of anthropology at that time, was on kinship and manifestations of the family. And as such, there is a focus on, in a lot of early Caribbeanist anthropology, on rural populations. And this question about whether we are looking at familial interactions that are reflections of slavery and practices, whether they are reflections of African cultural practices that were brought over when people were enslaved and brought to the Caribbean, or whether we're looking at kind of a creation of new kind of synthetic kinship practices that emerge in this new space in the Caribbean. So that's where you see a lot of early Caribbeanist literature. So a lot of the kind of retentions versus syncretisms debate in the early work. And then as you kind of see Caribbeanist research, particularly ethnographic research, move on from this place, we see a lot more work emerge from Caribbeanist anthropologists themselves. And so we see a lot of discussion about what it means to be living in the Caribbean, what we know about kind of class and power, political movements, independence, and kind of a post-colonial identities. And so to this end, my work kind of wants to engage in both of these literatures. And so I'm thinking quite a bit about work by Deb Thomas, she has a piece called Modern Blackness, a book called Modern Blackness on nationalism and globalism and politics of culture in Jamaica. There's a great book by Barry Chavana called Learning to Be a Man. And Gina Ulysses' Downtown Ladies, of course, which talks about economies and informal economies in the Caribbean. So kind of my work on contemporary human populations has to kind of engage very heavily with this ethnographic literature on what it means to be living in the Caribbean, but also engage quite a bit on the, with the kind of biological anthropology literature, which is asking, quite frankly, what does it mean to survive and thrive? And how do we understand the trade-offs that people make over the course of their lives and how it impacts their physiology and survival? Stuart Hall said in 1999, culture comes into play at precisely the point where biological individuals become subjects, and that what lies between the two is not some automatically constituted natural process of socialization, but a much more complex process of formation. So building on all of these traditions, I situate my work as one wing of a Black feminist anthropology, where, as Irma McLaurin wrote, we're using the description, analysis, interpretations of social inequality and concomitant resistance as an entry point to construct its own theory, practice, politics, and poetics. And so when we talk a little bit about caretaking in the Caribbean and the work that I do, I want to think a little bit about centering Black women's lives in this narrative of what it means to be a parent and what it means to raise children. It's not enough just to kind of understand child physiology is my point here. So Michelle Wolf-Trio says, history is the fruit of power, but power itself is never so transparent that its analysis becomes superfluous. The ultimate mark of power may be its invisibility, the ultimate challenge, the exposition of its roots. And in this case, of course, Trio is not speaking at all about biological anthropology, but from a biological anthropology perspective and a biocultural anthropology perspective, I am very interested in power and how power leaves its mark on the body. So to that end, in my studies of racism, family, and health, I'm often interested in these axes of influence in the lives of the folks in the communities with which I work. So thinking about what it means to be Black, what does it mean to be, how do we think about identity, and what does it mean to be living in a post, and I put post in heavy quotations here, colonial present. In the context of the place that I work, I think a lot about colorism and power, and who has the power to say, in this case, in this example, from the Jamaica Gleaner, there was a politician who wants to move kind of working and poor folks out of the community they were living in Kingston, so that they could build new homes. So there's kind of issues of the same issues of kind of dislocation and gentrification that we see happening in the United States, also happening in a different context, but with different axes of influence. So colorism and power, class and access is an important kind of piece to keep in mind here in my work in the Caribbean. And then finally, the expectations that people have for their community members and for themselves as parents, their aspirations, and then their practices. Some of the factors associated with caregiving practices and ideologies, and this is a study participant with their nephew several years ago, are kind of cohesion of family units. So we can talk about big picture questions like I did on the previous slide where we're thinking about kind of class and access and colorism and power, but now we're thinking kind of everyday life, cohesion of family unit. And that doesn't mean people living in the same home. It means who we can depend on in our kind of broadly construed kinship networks. What is the home environment like? What are the educational opportunities for both parents and their children? And what are people experiencing with regards to safety and risk? When I started to do my work in the Caribbean, the murder rate in Jamaica was 10 times that the United States as controlled for per capita. So safety and risk are major things that parents are thinking about all the time when they're trying to provide their kids with the best care possible. And then finally, social engagement and kind of who are you connected to and how does that help you navigate all the kind of thorny issues of caretaking in this particular context. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about non-kin care and the Child Thriving Project that I've been worked on from 2010 to 2018. And I actually think that I'll probably start a next step of this project, but that's still kind of tentative. We'll talk about that. I can talk about that at the end. So where I work is Manchester Parish, Jamaica, and actually I have family there. My grandmother was from Manchester Parish, Jamaica, and came to Canada first and then the United States, actually nearly 100 years ago. So Mandeville, Jamaica is located about 2,000 feet above sea level. It's kind of in a breezy, cooler part of the country. It has a population of over 50,000 people, so it is very much an urban center. And interestingly, it is a site of bauxite mining where they can make aluminum products. And so it has a kind of reputation of being more financially stable than maybe some other parts of the country. To that end, lots of folks who moved away from Jamaica and made their lives in other places move back to Mandeville when they come back to Jamaica because it's seen as a kind of cool and comfortable place for older folks to live. This piece becomes kind of important because when I started my project on non-kin care and child thriving, the question that I was interested in was, what is going on with kids for whom the home that their community as a community defines it as being healthy, a home where you have family members taking care of you? What happens for kids for whom that is not available? And I started to talk to lots of folks that I had worked with in my first research project about this idea that there were kids who were not receiving appropriate care. And of course, everybody kind of knew it, and everybody knows that there are kids that for some reason or another have ended up in kind of residential care settings, but it wasn't a major topic of conversation. And when I started to say to folks, I think this is what I'm going to do my project on, I'm kind of interested in this, they said, oh, well, you must need to go to Kingston for that, because that's where most of the kids are that kind of need this kind of care. And we started to talk about how many different children's homes or what we might have previously thought of as orphanages were in Manchester Parish proper. Now, mind you, Jamaica is not a very big country. It's relatively small. So Manchester Parish is very small. And I said, well, let's count them up. And we started to count them up. And people would say, oh my goodness, there are 6 homes here. Well, yeah, I guess you don't have to go to Kingston. I guess you can kind of do this work here. And so that was a kind of interesting conversation to be having with people as we kind of discussed that fact that there are folks who actually need extra care and are not able to get it in a way that the community would deem to be appropriate. And so for this research, I collected ethnographic and biometric measurements from children who were 4 months to 18 years of age, living in children's homes and living with their community members in their families. And so from the children's homes, I collected information from 125 children, and then I was actually able to go back and get repeat data from 60 children. And I was able to sample 3 out of 6 of the children's homes in the residences throughout the parish. And so there were 6 children's homes. 3 of the children's homes I was not given permission to go into, 3 that I was. And we'll talk a little bit later on about why I wasn't allowed into those homes and the implications of that. With my research assistant and dear friend, Bridget Robinson, we collected basic demographic information, place of residence, household composition, daily activities that the children were engaged in, and kind of discussed with the children, and of course in an age appropriate way, depending on how old the kids were, psychosocial and financial support networks. It is not the case, as it is, and as we might imagine it in other contexts, that when children end up in these residential care settings, that they are automatically and completely cut off from all family members. They may have family members who come and check on them and want to help them out in whatever ways they can, but they're just not able to care for them in a full-time capacity. So it's a very kind of fluid care situation and different than maybe the isolation of a children's home or orphanage that you might imagine from kind of pop culture or the images that we got coming out of Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. I also collected anthropometric and biometric measurements, height. These are all kind of very standard: height, length, weight, skin fold measurements. Skin fold measurements tell us something about fat. It's good for kids to have a healthy amount of fat on their bodies. It helps them with growth and development. Blood pressure, mid-upper arm circumference, head circumference. Head circumference is for babies. And if any of you have children, you know that you go to get that well baby checkup, and they put that kind of tape around the baby's head to see about brain growth and to see that the baby is growing. And then I also collected saliva samples for assessments of immune strength. We compared these to the, I guess it's not recent WHO Anthro Plus standards. They came out in 2008, but they were much better than the standards that we were using before that. So in this study population, I have 112 males and 104 females. The average age is around 10. Most of the kids had siblings. And some of the kids had cell phones. As you might imagine, that kids who lived with their family members were more likely to have kind of cell phones. So why do I use cell phones here? It's a good kind of proxy assessment of access to resources for some of the kids. And some of the kids in the children's homes did actually have cell phones because family members would bring them by. So what did I find? Well, as you might imagine, a kind of straightforward hypothesis is that kids who are living in children's homes are not going to be doing as well as kids who live with their family members. I had a program officer from NSF tell me when I started the study that I probably needed to rethink that hypothesis. And I was like, well, but no, but we're talking about kinship and the importance of care, and I'm sure it's going to work this way. And they kind of pushed me on that. And of course, they really were providing some insight, and were actually correct. And so when we look at girls, and we see this effect most strongly with girls who are 5 to 11 years old. So there's this kind of critical period of growth and development where we can see these things play themselves out. We see that girls who are living with their family members tend to do better than girls who are living in children's homes. So not entirely surprising. And this works for weight for age, which is WFA, and height for age. Small effect size, but an effect size nonetheless. We also see this same trend stand out when we look at mid-upper arm circumference, again, a measure of kind of overall healthiness, and some skin fold thickness, which is SST. We see girls, specifically 5 to 11, who are living with family members, tend to be kind of in a kind of healthier condition physically than girls who are living in children's homes. When we look at boys, on its face, it looks like the same pattern is playing itself out, but it's actually a little bit more complex. So if we look at height for age for boys who are 5 to 11 years old, we see that boys who are living in a family home seem to look like they're doing great. However, this is actually only statistically significant and meaningful for boys as compared to boys in family homes as compared to boys in 2 of the children's homes, but not this central children's home of Guppy Pond. We see the same thing play out when we look at some skin fold thickness, where we have boys in family homes doing much better than boys at Irie House or Pear Tree Place, but not Guppy Pond. That is not a statistically significant relationship. So I started to ask myself, like, what is actually going on at Guppy Pond? And what we find with Guppy Pond is that the boys who are living in that home, and I should mention to you that that is an all boys home. So there's only boys in that sample. And also the boys and all the kids, girls and boys alike, are placed in homes randomly. They're just placed in homes based on availability. So it's not like all the boys that happen to be healthier are getting shuttled over to Guppy Pond. What I knew and what I learned from conversations with the caretakers at Guppy Pond is that they were doing fundamentally different kinds of caretaking practices with the boys in their homes. They had an open pantry policy where the boys could eat freely at any time of the day, which is unusual. And in fact, Bridget Robinson, my research assistant and dear friend, said to me, Robin, you know, we're not even allowed to eat freely in our own kitchens in our own homes. So this is completely surprising. She was shocked by that particular discussion in our conversation with the caretakers at the home. They also had an individual adult that they could turn to whenever they had any kind of concerns or questions. They were paired with an adult, almost like a kind of mentor or a kind of caretaker, specific caretaker. And it was kind of fascinating because when I arrived, they thought I was a psychologist, and I was kind of course, so sad to tell them that I'm not a psychologist, but they said, well, this is what we've been working on, and we've been working on attachment and helping the boys have a healthy attachment, which we know helps with growth and development and appropriate eating. When we think about questions of enrichment and isolation, the kids who were living with their family members were much more likely to say that they talk or share as part of the things that they do every day. Talking and sharing is just kind of like confiding and sharing one's feelings. The kids in the family homes, or in the children's homes rather, were less likely, statistically less likely, to say that they shared their feelings with anyone. We also know that the kids in the family homes were more likely to say that they had friends at school, whereas the kids in the children's homes were more likely to say that they saw their friends every day, but they were the friends that they saw, that they lived with in the children's homes. And so when we kind of flesh this out a little bit, what it looks like is that the children who are living with their family members have a kind of extensive friendship network that they've built in their communities and in their churches, and they may see them mostly at school, but they have these friends from all these different spaces. Whereas the kids who are living in the children's homes were much more likely to say that they have fewer friends, and that they only saw those friends at the place where they lived. despite going to school in the broader community. This plays itself out when we look at female friends and male friends. Kids in the family homes report having many more friends than kids in the children's homes. So we're looking at questions of kind of like social isolation here. As I'm kind of collecting these data, there are conversations happening in the broader public constantly in Jamaica about children's well-being. This is a kind of constant conversation. And at the time, it was discussed as a crisis in Jamaica. There was a 28% increase in cases of children who had experienced neglect and abuse from 2011 to 2012. Interestingly, there's a gender dynamic to this, where we see boys experiencing neglect more frequently and girls experiencing abuse more frequently. And we see this really early on in the literature from Erna Broadber, Jamaican Caribbeanist researcher who documented this in 1974. There's a paper by Sargent and Harris from 1992 that talks about this, and then articles in the Jamaica Observer and the Jamaica Gleaner from 2012 that are reporting these same patterns. So as part of my work, I was also interested in kind of the capacity of children's homes to provide reparative care. Like, can they do things to help, repair what the kind of challenging situations that these children have experienced before they came to the children's homes? So to that end, do children's homes differ in their capacity to support growth as assessed over a 2-year period? And do boys and girls experience different changes in growth over a 2-year period? And so what we see over time is that there are still these kinds of gender differences in growth follow-ups, where the girls are still doing better than the boys. When we look at some skin fold thickness or height for age, the girls are doing a little bit better than the boys. And is there evidence of differences in growth over time? Well, yes, the girls seem to be growing at a kind of accelerated pace in the 2 years between my data collection. And we see this in some skin fold thickness again and height for age. And so what we see is that girls continue to have significantly better growth measures than their male peers. And girls in homes have significantly higher rates of change in growth measures over a 2-year period. Now, we might want to say, oh, well, this is just, like we might lean into or want to lean into this, like girls mature faster than boys. And what you're seeing is that girls are just, no. I want to push back against that idea right away, because one, we know there's a lot of overlap in terms of pace of development between girls and boys. What I think is actually happening, and there's some evidence of this in the ethnographic literature, is that girls are showing up in the children's homes in slightly better condition, even though they've experienced trauma. It's not, for the most part, hasn't been neglect than their male peers, and they continue along that trajectory because their early set point has been somewhat healthier. I was able to, thanks to the Wenner Grant Engaged Anthropology Grant, go back and kind of revisit the homes and share my findings with the communities that allowed me to collect these data. 3 out of the 6 children's homes that I went to, the 3 that I was not allowed to visit in the beginning, were closed temporarily or permanently when I returned. The home where the children were doing the best, despite a change in leadership, continued to thrive. And so one of the things that the director said to me in a conversation there was, look around, there are no gates here. This is not a prison. And he had a very kind of straightforward and clear-cut idea about agency for the children, the ideas that he wanted in terms of what kind of caretaking he wanted to provide for the children, and then what opportunities that could allow the children. And I will say that in the other children's homes, there were kind of large fences that prohibited the kids from moving around freely. And so finally, I'm not going to go into too much depth into this, but I just want to finish up by telling you where this research has kind of led me. And so one of the questions that kind of emerged from this work was, well, what are the situations that, or the conditions that create situations where kids end up in the children's homes? And one of the things that emerged was this relationship between the global labor market and parental investment for Caribbean women. And this is where race and racism kind of makes itself present in this story, again, in a very kind of overt way. How can we, and to this end, I'm asking questions now that have to engage with like how we understand parental investment and migration. How do we understand how people think about caring for their children and what they're able to do with regards to care for their children when they live in another country? And this is a picture of the Windrush boat, which is a boat that brought Jamaican immigrants to England in the mid-20th century. So we know that there are these huge migration streams out of the Caribbean into the UK, Canada, and Great Britain. And that's where my research is taking me now, is into Canada. We know that there are labor laws that support kind of immigration and sponsoring, particularly of Black women moving from the Caribbean into these spaces to do caretaking work. And so this is a trend that's been going on for 30 or more years. You can see this picture here is from 1982, and it's called Black Nannies and White Types. And this is a kind of thing we talk a lot about in kind of Caribbean labor and migration stories of women moving to do caretaking work in another context when they may have children at home. Christine Ho in 1992 coined the term of transnational families, and she kind of theorized around this idea that we have to broaden our conception of what caretaking looks like for these families where women are doing a lot of international labor work. And what we see is this exportation of high skilled and domestic labor. So everything from kind of nursing to cleaning, but it's a lot of women leaving these spaces. And so I'm asking now questions in my research of what are the experiences of parents and children as they navigate what it means to be Black, what it means to be kind of your identity as kind of an immigrant in these new spaces, and how do you do the kind of caretaking that you want to do in these contexts when you're not in the kind of space where you had different kinds of support, maybe earlier on in your life or earlier on in your parenting life. We know there's a discussion of barrel children. So these are children, this is the term, I have not coined this term. This is the term for children who are kind of left in the United States or excuse me, in the Caribbean when their parents travel abroad and they are sent different resources in a barrel. And so there's a lot of discussion about the kind of growth development and psychosocial development of kids who are experiencing this kind of exchange of resources. And so we have to kind of diversify our thinking, particularly as biological anthropologists, and think about caretaking as happening within a global economy. And for Black families, there are particular kinds of parameters that come along with moving out of countries that are pluralistic and predominantly Black into countries where you are now minoritized and perhaps marginalized. And so folks to that end have been thinking about questions of kin care versus non-kin care in these new contexts. I've been kind of developing a project looking at these particular intersections of race, family, and health outcomes through the Canadian Center for Refugee and Immigrant Healthcare. And hopefully after COVID, I'll be able to get back there. That's been, delayed, of course, because of COVID. And we know that in Canada, immigrants are 20% of the population. And so I'm very interested in the caretaker-child dynamic and the impact of kind of political status, socioeconomic status, and cultural capital, and adjustment on health, survivorship, and reproduction for Black families. And so I think to that end, some of the questions that I've been interested in have to kind of engage with a feminist caretaking ethos and thinking about how families, Black families particularly, engage in risk mediation. This is going to take us into a conversation about the role of the state and social welfare and restrictive immigration forms and the experience of primary care parent-child dyads in this new colonial context. And so, what is the evidence here for the embodied experience via parallel or divergent biologies of parents and their children? So I'm going to skip this slide and actually go to this one. which tells you a little bit about how I think about these things. So we can kind of assess from a biological standpoint, psychosocial stress and support, exposure to pathogens, physical growth. But I'm thinking, you know, when we kind of engage in these broader questions of Blackness, identity, and migration, and parental investment from, you know, which is kind of anchored in evolutionary theory, we also have to think about like cultures of child rearing, food insecurity, non-kin community practices, social competence, engagement in global markets, and migration streams. And so the way that this works, you know, it's so interesting, as you all know, as kind of researchers or people interested in these broader questions, is that it starts to emerge in all these different spaces in your work, places where you weren't even thinking about these questions. And so in my desire to kind of get at a more dynamic model of parental investment for Black families in a kind of contemporary human landscape, I've started to think a lot about the way that those early ideas of racism and race as real show up in our assessments of Black caregiving in the 21st century. How do those old ideas of, you know, presented by Blumenbach still kind of rise and show up? How does the culture of poverty still impact how we think about Black families? And so I've been doing kind of more work on that end, on these questions of race and racism, because they're frankly inescapable when I start to think about the challenges that Black caretakers are presented with as they try to enable child thriving in kind of post-colonial spaces, particularly ones where they are marginalized or minoritized. So to that end, thank you so much to the UCF College of Sciences, all the study participants, and folks in Canada who are facilitating my next project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robin. That was, or Dr. Nelson, sorry, that was a very fantastic talk, particularly for somebody like me who is very interested in child growth and development in ancient populations. So this has given me more to kind of think about in terms of caregiving. So thank you so much. And I just want to say on behalf of the College of Sciences that we've been very honored to host you for this distinguished speaker series. So thank you for coming today and doing this. Before we launch into a great question and answer session, I just want to tell everybody to just hang tight. We're going to launch into that. So you're able to ask Dr. Nelson any questions that you might have by simply typing them into the question and answer field that you see at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can get to in the time that we have left today. So I just wanted to also mention that our COSTalks series is going to take a few months of hiatus, and we're going to begin back in August for the fall 2021 semester. And we're hoping to actually be able to host these talks in a hybrid manner, both face-to-face and also in a virtual option. So please check our website, sciences.ucf.edu/COSTalks for more information and also where you can RSVP for our fall series. So once again, thank you all for coming today. Please stay tuned for our question and answer session. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Beatriz Reyes-Foster, an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, and she is going to moderate our question and answer session today. So thank you once again. Dr. Reyes-Foster.
Dr. Nelson, that was fantastic. Oh, I hope did I start off? I may have cut me off. Well, thank you, Dr. Dupre, and thank you, Dr. Nelson. That was really fantastic. So I'm not seeing any questions yet, but we have 84 members in the audience, so I am sure that there are questions out there that have just not made it onto the Q&A. So while there we go. So one of the attendees is asking about getting in touch with you and learning more about your research.
Sure. So I am, if you go to the Santa Clara University website, there's a little kind of message box, and you can certainly send me an email. I'm also on Twitter, probably too much, truth be told. And you can always find me there and message me. And, you know, I'll be happy to talk to you about the research. And whatever way you find me is fine with me, is what I really should say.
Great. So, so I have another question. Would you be interested in doing research on the effects of your research in the workplace?
Yes, absolutely. So, okay, so part of, so Beatrice knows this, of course, but part of what I do when I'm not doing this work is I actually did like a project with several other researchers on sexual harassment and assault in the field research, field sciences. So that's our workplace, right? We travel often to collect data in different places, and we were interested in issues of gender discrimination and particularly bullying, harassment, and assault. And one of the things that kind of really emerged from that project, which was called the SAFE study, is that there are all of these intersections of identity where we need to ask questions about, you know, equity in the workplace. And so one kind of, you know, I would kind of like say, you know, side project, or for some reason I'm thinking about highways, like an access road that would kind of get me back to these questions is, what is happening for the women who have migrated, and what kind of experiences are they having in the workplace, in their new workplaces as caretakers, as people who are often, but not always, paid under the table. You know, the families that work with them need them very much, but there is very much a power dynamic happening there. And so I think there's lots of ways to kind of ask questions about, you know, identity, our goals, our ambitions and expectations, and what we actually experience. And that could be for us in the workplace, but that could also be for the communities in which I work, with which I work, rather.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. I have another one here. Thank you so much. I am a huge fan of you and your work. How do you think we can unlearn racial biases and stereotypes to ensure proper resources and support is given to non-kin families and support system, especially in Black communities?
So I'm gonna say right now that Izzy Hernandez is one of my favorite former students. So she is a fan because she has sat in my classes. So I know who Izzy is, but thank you, Izzy, for coming. So I think so interesting in unlearning racial biases. You know, if you go to therapy, sometimes your therapist will say to you that we cannot necessarily not feel that kind of knee-jerk response to whatever trigger we experience. But what we can do is change our response to it, right? We don't always have to respond the same way. And so when we think a little bit about unlearning racial biases, I don't know that we're unlearning them. I don't know that we can really unlearn them. What I think we can do is be very aware of the ways that they manifest themselves, so that when they crop up, rather than sinking into denialism, which is often what happens in different kinds of workspaces or communities, we say, oh, that's not really happening. We can say, this is this person's experience, or this is what this community is experiencing. Let's take a pause and figure out how to rectify that situation. So I don't know that we can unlearn them, but I think that we need to be accepting of the fact that they exist and that we perpetrate them. And if we are actually going to provide resources and support to Black communities, then we have to acknowledge that it's a problem. And I would say that we are still doing that very first step of work of kind of acknowledging the inequities so that we can get to kind of a more fair and just space.
So I have another question here. Do you see your research going to other Caribbean countries in the future?
Yes, yes. So, you know, I initially actually really wanted to work in Haiti, and there was a coup in Haiti when I started to do research there, and so I had to stop. There are a lot of questions. So the Caribbean to me as a region is fascinating from like a linguistic standpoint and a kind of colonial standpoint, post-colonial standpoint, but also kind of the relationship of the Caribbean as a region to kind of the United States and other countries, right? Like there's a lot of kind of dispossession sometimes that happens in the Caribbean and extraction of resources out of the Caribbean. That being said, the Caribbean is its own kind of cultural space. And so I would love to be able to go. I've always thought about going to Trinidad. Trinidad has very different kinds of kind of migration and colonial histories, right? So you have different communities in Trinidad than you do in Jamaica. And so I've often thought about Trinidad and Barbados as two countries that I would love to just kind of see. You know, I would not claim to know enough. I mean, the interesting thing about starting new research is you realize how much background you need to get before you can even really get to your research questions. So I would love to kind of explore the possibilities there.
Great. Does the research and history of child labor in Jamaica, thinking about historian Shani Roper's work here, tell us anything more about tracing racial ideology in family constructs and placement of children today?
Yes, yes. So it's very, very interesting. There's a lot of discussion about what childhood means. One of the interesting things about doing childhood research or children research for children is that you kind of come to this understanding, which I don't think I really interrogated before I started this work, that childhood is not a universal phenomenon. Like what we mean by childhood, what children should experience is not a kind of universal thing. And more than that, within specific cultures and spaces, there's not a universal kind of agreement or consensus upon what kids should do or should not do. And so we do see a lot of conversation around class and access, which is part of why I put those down as like axes of influence, about what children should experience, how much labor they should be doing, where they should live, is it appropriate to move them around? All of these questions are kind of bubbling under the surface of these kinds of very proximate tensions around abuse and neglect. Like when does kind of what some families consider to be completely normal child labor engagement within the family, when does that not track with the broader community in terms of what is appropriate for kids to be doing and the movement of kids between homes? And so I'll just say this very quickly. In my first project, I was talking to adults about their experiences as kids. And a couple of the folks I was speaking to talked to me about moving to different people's homes because their parents were working in another country. And so they were moving between homes and they were expected to do certain kinds of work to kind of keep up their end of the bargain for being kind of, for being allowed to stay with that relative. And they as adults were reflecting on that kind of tension. And a lot of it was also around kind of class and colorism issues as well in those families. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you see migrant female populations experience a lack of opportunities when searching for childcare through employers?
So I'm still working through this. And I think that, you know, so when I say I'm still working through this, I'm still kind of, you know, just at the beginning stages of kind of meeting with and speaking with women who have migrated. One of the big things that I hear them discuss, rather than a lack of opportunities, is like a dissatisfaction with the opportunities that are available, that maybe these are not the contexts in which they would want their kids cared for. And so for some of the women whose children stayed in their countries of origin, what they say is that I know that they will be okay there. I don't necessarily want to raise them here right now. And there's a kind of envisioned future when the finances are different, or when they are more in a more kind of steady space where they can reunite with their children and provide them the life that they want to provide them in the Caribbean. I mean, in Canada or in the United States. But there is some dissatisfaction of like, you know, I'm here and this is a really good opportunity for our family, but this is not exactly the kind of childcare I would want my children to get. So there's that kind of like cultural dissonance of knowing what you're doing for kind of resource availability for your family, but that's not always, you know, that's not always the option you want as a parent.
The implications of your work for US immigration policy seem profound. Do you think practices like those of the past few years, where parents and children were separated at the border, would have physical manifestations like those you documented in Jamaica?
Yeah, I was having a very hard time, as I'm sure most of us were, you know, just even watching and learning and reading about what children were experiencing at the border. Like, you know, very, very hard time. Like, I even talking about this right now kind of makes me a little bit teary, because we cannot act like that those choices that we made as a government did not have profound impacts on the lives of those kids. Trauma, real trauma, which, you know, is when I talk about like embodied experiences, this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about everything from impaired growth to impaired sleep to kind of socialization challenges because you're scared as a kid. You know, these experiences really early on can be incredibly detrimental. And so one of the things that I was struck by in watching all of that happen was how little we care. And there's plenty of evidence from everyone from neuroscientists to psychologists to sociologists and anthropologists that children really do need a particular kind of matrix of care to thrive later on. And as who said this? Adam Sewer, maybe? The cruelty is the point, right? That clearly that we know this, and we didn't do anything to kind of make sure those kids weren't traumatized. Like, the trauma was the point. So yes, I do think that it'll play out that way. And I think we'll be paying the price, and those children will be paying the price for a long time. And it's absolutely devastating and was unnecessary.
Changing gears a little bit. You mentioned using saliva to measure immunity. Did you find any differences in your study populations? Have you considered looking at cortisol as a measure of stress related to growth and development?
Yeah, so I did find differences, and I didn't present data here because it was just kind of like, you know, too much data. I don't want to beat you over the head with data, but yeah, so the kids who were living in children's homes had kind of a heightened immune response, which we typically tend to think, I mean, we want our immune system to respond well. We've been thinking about this with the vaccine, right? We've been telling everyone that the second shot's going to knock you out because that's your immune system kind of, you know, really responding to the vaccination. But what this kind of reflected in the data I have was that the children were just in kind of circumstances where they were being exposed to more pathogens on a regular basis than kids who were living in family homes, which, you know, makes total sense because they're living in kind of a communal setting. They don't have a lot of personal space. People are coming and going because there's a lot of folks who work there who then go home and then come back again, right? And we typically don't have that same movement of people in and out of our homes when we live with our family members. So cortisol, yeah. So cortisol is like fascinating and it's great to use. The challenge with cortisol, and so part of what human biologists talk all the time, if you ever see the phrase field friendly, what we were talking about is like, is the thing you want to collect, one, salient for the community that you're, does it reflect the salient question for the community you work with? But also, is it feasible? Cortisol is hard for me, not for everyone, because you need 2 measurements. And you typically need more than just that one set of 2. You need a couple. And so requiring people to give me a morning and afternoon or evening sample more than one time is not really feasible for my field site. They're already like, why do you want our spit? This is low-key very gross. I don't know why you want this. And I have to explain to them kind of what I'm going to do with it, and that I don't mean them any harm. And it's not it's like less invasive than another way of assessing these things. So I've actually not done cortisol at my field site, but I do things like IgA and alpha amylase, which are different ways of kind of measuring bodily activation, particularly around the immune system, because cortisol is not as feasible. So that's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you talk a bit about the problems with using medical standards such as BMI as related to human biological variation, and how does this impact your research?
Yes, so this is a fantastic question. BMI is a problem. And I can tell you from a very technical standpoint why BMI is a problem, but most of you know that BMI is a kind of assessment of your weight over your height, right? But it doesn't take into account things like muscle mass, right? So if you kind of look at professional athletes, sometimes their BMIs look incredibly high. And if they were to go into a clinician's office, the clinician would tell them you're terribly unhealthy, when in fact we know they're very fit, right? Because the muscle weighs more than fat. So BMI has real limitations. It was created as a measure like in the Army. It's not supposed to be diagnostic at all. And then now it's used in a diagnostic sense all the time. I was really lucky to do a School for Advanced Research seminar organized by Andrea Wiley at the University of Indiana. And we did it on biological normalcy, like what things are considered normal. And Dan Hushka from ASU, Arizona State, did a whole piece on BMI and how limited it is. And so when we think about the kinds of health measures I take, some of the questions that I'm asking are really about kind of broad strokes, right? So I'm not trying to be diagnostic here. I'm trying to say, if I look for height for age, and we compare it to kind of the WHO standards, which take into account populations all over the world. If I have a child who, when we look at populations all over the world, is 2 or 3 standard deviations shorter than we would expect for a kid his age, what is going on? And I did actually have a child in my study in that situation where I assumed he was 5 and he was 9 because he had experienced stunting. And so BMI has real limitations. And so we try to work around it by using a lot of other kinds of supplementary measures of specifically child growth. So that's why I was telling you a lot about fat, because we want kids to be a little, have a little meat on them. And kids who are kind of underweight, especially in the case where I'm dealing with kids who have experienced abuse and neglect, we know that there's probably some trauma in their past. But yeah, very good question. And one that, believe it or not, we think about all the time as human biologists, and try to figure out how to move away from these kinds of inaccurate assessments.
Great. Regarding your research on non-kin families versus kin families, do you think that you would see similar findings in major cities like Kingston or Mobay?
That's a great question. Yes, I do. I think it would probably, I think that I would see similar patterns. I think that, so Kingston itself, and part of the reason why folks in the community where I live when I'm in Jamaica said, oh, you better go to Kingston, is because Kingston has more children's homes than Mandeville does and Manchester has. And so, if you're living in a situation where you have a kind of dramatic stretches of inequity in the community, where you have communities where folks are really struggling, some neighborhoods, and some folks are like living really well, then you are going to see kind of even a more, I would say, dramatic effect in the children's homes. So I do think I would see it. I also think, you know, one of the fascinating things about this is that not all the kids were from Manchester Parish. Most of them were, but because they're placed wherever there's a home, there were some kids that were from as far away as Kingston. And so we know that, like, this is not a problem that's specific to Mandeville. This is not a problem that's specific to Jamaica, right? Like, this is just one way of answering it by looking at Manchester Parish. But yeah, absolutely.
Due to the extremely emotionally charged nature of your work, I was curious how you navigate these sensitive topics and areas without becoming overwhelmed.
Oh, I don't navigate them well. I appreciate you asking that question so much, honestly. At one point, I was working on these data and working on the project on sexual harassment and assault in field research at the same time. And I would just be like toggling between these two data sets. And in one case, I'm looking at kids and I'm like, oh, that child is an outlier. And then I would scroll over and look at their age and realize, you know, like I just said, like they were much younger or much older than I expected them to be, but they were much, you know, further underweight than I expected, you know, and I would just have to sit there. And at the same time, I had just had a child. So this all just hit home in this way where my questions changed also, because I became a parent and I started to understand how complicated and hard it is to be parenting and wanting to give your kids certain things and not able to, and what happens when it's out of your control. And so yes, no, I become overwhelmed, but I think that it helps me never get comfortable with the challenging data that I encounter. I don't ever want to be comfortable thinking about the struggles that families face. So it is very overwhelming, but I'm okay with that.
Thank you. Awesome talk. Do you have ideas on how the socioeconomic status of the surrounding community of these children's homes may influence the observed growth disparities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the interesting things about these children's homes is that they are funded differently. And so what I went into this thinking that they were all kind of receiving like some umbrella funding, you know, from some overarching organization. And that's not actually what's going on. Many of the children's homes are sponsored by the church, a church, you know, or the Salvation Army, or they are private and independent. And so that is really what's impacting quite a bit some of the differences. I do think that for the home where the boys were really thriving, very interestingly, that children's home is very close to the church that sponsors it. And so when people are coming to church, they know they're seeing the children's home every day. And so I think that the kind of the giving response, community response, care for these kids is different because they are right there next to the home every time. They're seeing the boys run around when they come to church. Whereas like the Salvation Army, who was actually in charge of the other two homes that I visited, that is an umbrella organization that kind of distributes funds. And the community is less involved on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it absolutely does make a difference. And particularly maybe, you know, wanting to put something in place as ambitious as an open feeding, open pantry policy, like that requires resources. And I'm sure that relationship allowed for that. That's a great question.
Have you ever collaborated with research with psychologists? Thank you for this webinar. It was very informative.
Yes, thank you so much. So I haven't collaborated formally on my work, but I have engaged in a lot of like conferences and conversations with psychologists. So psychologists have informed my research quite a bit. A lot of my understanding of child development, what we want to see in terms of psychosocial development, and understanding just the broad range of how kids grow. Like I can talk to you a lot about physical growth, but what I've understood about kind of psychosocial development has come from conversations with psychologists. So their work, if you read any of my work, the psychologists are cited through and through because they are really helping me better understand kind of what variability in child development looks like.
Wonderful. Would measuring gut microbiome diversity be feasible in the field as a metric for measuring health and strength of the immune system? I would posit that the children's alpha diversity would be greater in the children's home than in family homes, and I would love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, so I think that's true. I think that you're probably right about that. I think that's likely. Feasibility would be interesting, right? So I think we'd be talking about collecting fecal samples, and as bioanthropologists, like we're fine with feces. Truthfully, I know it sounds random, but we are. But again, it goes back to like, would that be a culturally appropriate kind of sample to collect? I think that it would be easier with younger children. I think it would be harder with older children. I think it would be very hard with adults. I'm pretty sure that most of my community members who participated in my research would be like, a step too far, Robin. That is a step too far. So with the kids, I think it could be feasible. I think I could definitely like work on it. But you know, I think that because the nature of the work that I do is so sensitive in terms of the topic, I've often shied away from asking for more what is considered invasive biometric samples because the kind of qualitative data I'm collecting is already incredibly sensitive, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Amazing talk. This work seems extremely interdisciplinary. How do you navigate the different disciplines? Do you focus on one and branch, or try to incorporate all aspects at once, especially with different people within the fields?
That is a really good question. I actually took out a slide where I talk a little bit about that. But depending on the kinds of data I'm collecting or the analysis that I'm writing up, I try to go as deep as I possibly can with that specific thing and then pull out and see how I can integrate it. So that when I'm like collecting, you know, when we're doing interviews or I'm collecting ethnographic data, you know, I'm trying to very much engage with the ethnographic research as much as possible. That's often sociologists, Caribbeanist sociologists or Caribbeanist anthropologists, and also psychologists, sometimes with some kind of behavioral data. And then when it comes to things that are just like hormonal biology data, I am like deep in that literature, really trying to understand where to go with that. I will say that what it's required of me is a little bit more patience than sometimes I want, because I want to really give respect to the folks who have done the deep dives in this work. And so what that means is that sometimes the data analysis takes a while. But yes, I'm trying to do it all at once, truthfully. And then depending on the audience I'm talking to, I can kind of go deeper into one aspect of the literature or another.
Great. So I do have a question that I see just about the nature of the classes that you teach at university.
Yeah, so I teach a class called Introduction to Biological Anthropology, which in our university is a natural science requirement. And what we often get are students who are nervous about taking a science, and they're kind of like, they've been scared off from something like chemistry. And so they're like, I think I'll take an anthropology class. They're often a little bit worried because we do have some like math and science, you know, hardcore science, but I love teaching that class because I think I like to call it a gateway. It's a gateway into anthropology and it's a gateway into the sciences. And I think that we cover everything from fossils to primates to the stuff I did today. Because I like to kind of give students the opportunity to know that they can do science even if they've been dissuaded from it in the past. I also teach a class called Evolutionary Medicine, which is about kind of how we are adapted and kind of the sometimes mismatches between human evolution and our current kind of living situation. And then finally, I teach some seminars, but then the other class I really love talking about and teaching is called The Biology of Poverty, where we talk about the relationship between systemic inequity and biological processes and how they become kind of embedded in one another.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. So we have 3 minutes left. If anyone wants to ask any lingering questions, now is the time. And one just came through. In situations where there were mentors to each child, assigned to each child, were they also involved with the church or involved with sports of some kind?
No, so typically not. So in that case, these were folks who lived at, or excuse me, worked at the children's homes. And one of the things that the director had kind of explained to me was that she wished that she had kind of more access to mental health clinicians. But what she had done was given anyone who worked at the home a child to pair with. So this could be folks who work on the laundry. This could be the cooks. This could be caretakers, right? But anybody. And so what these folks basically served as was the adults that you could turn to in a case of crisis. And so they weren't really involved with the church unless they wanted to be. And the kids weren't really involved in sports, though they did get kind of big into soccer. And when I came back to visit, they actually had like a brand new soccer pitch, which was kind of amazing. But no, these were just kind of like adults who served as kind of a sounding board for the children, and the adults had any role at all in the home, but the kids needed to know that they would see the adults several days a week. And that was really important for attachment.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. This was really fantastic. It was a fascinating talk. I think we got some really wonderful questions as well. Those of you who are undergraduate or graduate students, we are having a separate event later with Dr. Nelson. Please feel free to follow up with me if you did not see the link, the registration link for that meeting.
Thank you.
I think that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.